Hello everyone, and welcome to this Padova Hegel Lecture. Hello everyone online as well. It's a pleasure to have you here. This is the 7th lecture in the series that we organized to celebrate Hegel's 250th anniversary, now 252nd anniversary. So we are extremely happy that we can do this in person as much as possible, and we're happy that it's possible to travel from the US again safely, so that we can have a guest that we have been expecting for long, namely James Kreines, that is giving the lecture today. James is a friend and a leading scholar in classical German philosophy. He's a specialist in Kant, post-Kantian thinking, and especially in the area of metaphysics and history of metaphysics. So I'm not going to list all the publications of Jim, just going to mention the classic, which is Reasoning the World, published for Oxford University Press in 2015, I think. Today, Jim is going to give a talk titled Reviving the Old Story of Reviving a Metaphysical System a la Spinoza, Kant's Dialectic and the Challenge, and Hegel's as a Solution, which I think is part of a larger book project that Jim is writing, but he will maybe tell us more about it and introducing it. So please welcome with me, James Kreines.
Thank you very much, Luca. Thanks both Lucas for inviting and organizing. Really, I always learn a great deal from speaking in Padova, just because the tradition of classical German philosophy is so strong. I always get the best questions here that have really had a lasting impact on my work, including how my new project differs from my previous project, things that I've learned in Padova. So thank you very much. If you have questions, you don't feel that they're making it into the time that we have, or just you want to express them in an email, please send me emails. I know it sounds strange, but I love receiving emails that say you are wrong, because, and I always learn a lot from that too, so I certainly welcome it. You've got my email on the handout. So I'm going to speak about reviving the old story of reviving a metaphysical system a la Spinoza, Kant's Dialectic as Challenge, and Hegel's as Solution. I think it's already too warm, so I've pretended to dress nicely, and now I'm less. 6 weeks ago, I had COVID, and I still cough sometimes, so that's why I'm coughing. Okay, so let me start a timer. First thing I want to talk about is the interpretive challenge, a project that I understand myself as engaged in. So one popular way to go interpreting texts of classical German philosophy would be to look for something that's very much alive in philosophy today and try to read classical texts so that they come as close as possible to what we're interested in today. So there might be a form of linguistic philosophy, perhaps, and we look to see if we can make Hegel similar to that. And I actually am interested in going in the opposite direction. So I oppose that way of reading classical German philosophy. And the reason is because I think that what's interesting, a large part of what's interesting about the history of philosophy is finding philosophical arguments in history that are against the way we do philosophy now. It's not a matter for me of going backwards, it's a matter of letting the past help teach us to criticize the present so we can go forward in a way that's informed by the history of philosophy. So I want to let Hegel be Hegel, and the views I'll be ascribing to Hegel are not popular today, and that's by design. So this method gets more complicated when we think about reading multiple historical philosophers in engagement with each other. So in my case, Hegel as responding to Kant. And the reason is I feel like a lot of people today, they choose from the beginning some contemporary view that they like, and then they try to read historical philosophers as having that view. They're going to make all historical philosophers sound like they're the same thing. You often see that in the form of ideas that Hegel is completing Kant's philosophy, as if Kant wanted to be Hegel already and couldn't figure out how to do it. So on my account, I want to let Hegel be Hegel and let Kant be Kant. I think they have deeply opposing philosophical agendas, projects. And what's interesting about German idealism then is that you find strong arguments that engage across a gulf between different conceptions of what philosophy is and how to do philosophy. So I'm letting Hegel be Hegel and letting Kant be Kant. In Hegel in particular, what I'm investigating is how far we can go to do justice to find arguments for views that would make sense of the famous comparisons Hegel makes between his science of logic and what we find in the history of metaphysics about what is first, highest, God, absolute. For example, in the history of metaphysics in the form of Aristotle's metaphysics and Spinoza's metaphysics. And here I'm trying, I don't mean to presume that anyone has read my book, but if you happen to know anything about the book, I am trying to go a lot farther than what I did do in that book, and so really take a step away from where I was there. If you like that account, that's also happy and fine with me, but I'm looking for something new, and I'm happy to admit that I'm changing my mind on these things. So the kind of experimental view, I've said that I see in German idealism these opposing programs, conflicting conceptions of what philosophy should do. And here's my sort of experimental view of the opposing programs of Kant and Hegel that I want to try to defend today. I'm not saying this is true, you must accept it, or you're taking it as a hypothesis. It's more like, how far can I go to defend this way of conceiving the projects and how they relate? So I want to try to see Hegel, for reasons I just mentioned, of doing justice to those famous passages, as demonstrating a metaphysical system modeled in some ways on Spinoza's. And here's just an initial sense of the sense in which I think this is true. In such a system, there is something that's absolute. It's conceived through itself, which is either the same thing as or the other side of saying that its nature, it gives itself its own nature or makes itself what it is. And everything else relates to the absolute in the same way. That is, everything depends on everything is conceived through the absolute, and everything depends on the absolute for its being what it is. That, I think, idea is in Spinoza, and I think it's one that Hegel thinks he can do better than Spinoza. Now, I said opposing projects, so by contrast, I don't think Kant was trying to get to that kind of metaphysical system. I think the Critical Kahn is a radical critic of that kind of system, and we should let Kant be Kant, not decide favorites from advance, but think about their arguments. So the critical philosophy is arguing that rationalist metaphysical system building, like in Spinoza, is dogmatic. It exceeds the limits of our knowledge. We are limited or restricted to the bounds of sensibility, and so we can't have knowledge of things in themselves, and we can never successfully build such a metaphysical system. That's the point in my mind of a critique of the illusion of reason, which I think is central to what the first critique is about. So Hegel is aiming to demonstrate in a new way, a way that engages with Kant, right? Spinoza can't have been aware of Kant, and Hegel wants to revive Spinoza in light of Kant's arguments against that kind of program. And so doing, I think, comes up with something interestingly new. But now here's a central problem for this idea. So far, I've just been saying, where things are going in different directions, but I'm just saying it. Like, here's the philosophical central problem, although several others hang off this one. It's of course common to think that Hegel's trying to revive Spinoza in some way, but I find that where people read Hegel in this way, read him with Spinozist ambitions, they always portray him as doing a terrible job of philosophical argument, and essentially begging the question by assuming the things that Kant already argued against. So just as an example from Dusing, although there's tons of them I cite here, Hegel's Kant critique is also nicht immanent. He just assumes what Kant argued against. Now, a lot of people read Hegel in ways where he begs the question this way, he argues terribly, and they don't see that that's what they're doing, but at least Dusing tells us that, as do the other thinkers that I've cited here. So you often see people read Hegel and just say, Hegel assumes that to be is to be intelligible. The next step of the argument is this. But wait, if you start there, you've already lost with respect to Kant, who argued that we cannot make reality fully intelligible. So my challenge is to try to argue that Hegel can engage imminently with Kant in defense of something as ambitious as a Spinozist style metaphysical system. That's the problem I'd like to solve today. How can you argue imminently without obviously begging the question against the brilliance and radicality of Kant's critique of this kind of system? There'll be several other things that fall out of this, including consideration of why the doctrine of essence in science logic doesn't block the path to such a metaphysical system, but that's the main challenge I want to think about. So I've got this, so I'm calling it simple, but I'm sure I've made things more complex than they need to be, and I haven't managed to boil it down simply enough. And to some degree, this is my attempt at a simple idea about German idealism more generally. So I gave a talk closely related, a twin talk to this one that was more about Jacobi than about Kant just a few days ago in Berlin in the Padova Freie Universität partnership. But today I'll focus more on Kant. And so putting the simple idea in terms of Kant, it's something like this. We misunderstand the reason we can't understand how Hegel could argue imminently for something like a Spinoza system is that we misunderstand the challenge for Kant in criticizing metaphysical systems. And we assume that in a way it's easier than it really is. And what the brilliance of the German idealist critics of metaphysical systems, people like Kant as well as Jacobi, is that they see that they need to begin with the premise that metaphysical systematizers would accept. And so what they do is they begin with the idea in Kant's case that reason itself is interested in the metaphysics of dependence or conditioning and ultimately the unconditioned. And they use that idea. They think that metaphysical system builders cannot resist that idea, but it's ultimately a poisoned chalice for them. The cup is irresistible for them. They must drink from it, but it poisons any chance of constructing a successful metaphysical system. And then the simple idea continues that everything in post-Kantian German idealism is a reaction to the strangeness, the unnaturalness. For us, that's backwards. We imagine that critique of systems is going to be different than this. I'll say how in a moment. The strangeness of the reactions in Fichte-Schelling, and especially Hegel is my focus, are all conditioned by the need to avoid this resource that seems so irresistible, beginning with something like Kant's conditioning relationship and the unconditioned, to build a metaphysical system. Because if you did begin there, you would poison your attempt. All right, so that's what I will try to talk about. Part one, Kantian dialectic as central challenge. So I've got this, what I call dialectic first reading of Kant's critique of pure reason, where the real action, what really makes the book brilliant, is in the transcendental dialectic, not the aesthetic and the analytic. That's what the program is built around. You can see it right in the title. It's a critique of reason. And the topic of transcendental dialectic is reason, and its task is to critique reason. That's where I think Kant has a non-question begging critique of rationalist metaphysical system building. So in other words, I think it is wrong what we naturally expect. What we expect is that Kant will begin, as he does temporally in a way, by elaborating the conditions of the possibility of our knowledge or cognition, and showing in that way that our knowledge or cognition is limited, and showing in that way that rationalists attempt to overstep our limits and therefore end up dogmatic. But that, I think, would be a terrible argument against the rationalists. And I guess I've talked about this here before and lots of other times before. A lot of it is in my book. But I think Kant needs something better than starting with analyzing the forms of judgment or knowledge or something like that. That's why I think the transcendental dialectic is key. And what's key about it for immanent critique is that he begins with these premises that I think are irresistible for rationalist system builders. In particular, the idea that the faculty of reason itself takes a legitimate, ineliminable interest in priority involving forms of dependence, like cause-effect, grounded, part-whole, forms of conditioning relationship, and ultimately the corresponding forms of unconditioned. I'll use arrow just to talk about these dependence relations where one thing is conditioned by another or dependent on another. And this is not that Kant is saying that bad philosophy is interested in this. Kant's philosophy is focused on finding the grounds or conditions of things. As you can see in the famous letter to Hertz, where he says the question is, what's the ground of the relation between representation and the object? He himself is advancing the cause of reason as he understands it in seeking grounds or conditions of things. But he doesn't think that this is optional. And so this wonderful passage in the A preface, where he admits lots of philosophers pretend to be indifferent to the metaphysical topics that are raised by the idea of conditioning and the unconditioned. But these so-called indifferentists, insofar as they think anything at all, this is roughly translating passage C, insofar as they think anything at all, always fall back into the metaphysics that reason is interested in. We take that to be the metaphysics of conditioning or dependence relations and the unconditioned. These seem like premises to me that someone like Leibniz or Spinoza are going to love. This is the first, all philosophy, all thinking is wrapped up in the kind of dependence that the rationalists think is necessary to then say that everything depends on God. You might think about Leibniz, who thinks everyone who's got a principle of sufficient reason is built into what thought is for Leibniz, and not just philosophical thought. All thinking is guided by this principle, so everyone's already used the principle on 1,000 occasions, and it's easy to engage them in argument drawing on that principle toward rationalism. So instead of starting with a principle that rationalists would contest, namely the first thing for philosophy to do is analyze the forms of our perception or intuition or something like that, Kant starts with something that rationalists would love, the chalice that they would love to drink from. But then he tries to show that it's poison for their project of building systems. And the first poison is the contradictions of the antinomy, the indirect argument for transcendental idealism, which I think is wonderfully sketched in this passage from the B preface that I call passage D here. What we need is an experiment to test this strange idea that Kant has introduced, that our knowledge is limited or restricted. The experiment is we assume that our knowledge is not restricted, and we try to do what reason requires us to do, namely think the unconditioned. And what we find is, under this assumption, we cannot think the unconditioned without contradicting ourselves. And that tells us that the assumption is incorrect. Our knowledge is not unrestricted. In fact, we're limited to knowledge of appearances. As he puts it later, this antinomy leads necessarily back to this limitation of our knowledge. That, to my mind, is the real threat to metaphysical system building, or at least one half of it, not an initially epistemological based criticism. But there's more poison in the chalice that's important as well, because you might think that the antinomy attacks cosmology. It attacks reasoning from objects of sense to their conditions, etc., to try to get to something like God or some unconditioned ground for them. And you might think that a metaphysical system builder can avoid that way of reasoning. Indeed, you might think that Spinoza did avoid that way of reasoning. Perhaps Spinoza did it by beginning not with something else that's not God and reasoning by dependence to God, but rather just beginning with God and the very idea of a causa sui, a cause of itself, and reasoning purely on that basis, that God must exist, and to try to rule out other things besides God in order to generate a monist metaphysical system in particular. So it's important, if you want to block metaphysical system building in this way, to attack as well this idea of beginning with the idea of a causa sui, or God as cause of itself. And here again, I think, if we cede Kant's account of reason, the worries are pretty strong. And so Kant thinks that reason just is interested in this conditioning relation where one thing conditions another thing. And if that's true, then from the perspective of reason, the idea of a causa sui, something causing itself, grounding itself, even God as causing or grounding itself, is going to turn out to be incoherent. Because in order to utilize some metaphysical notion of dependence or grounding or causality, we have to separate one thing causing or grounding another. And yet we're trying to, in a causa sui, put the two things together. So you get Kant in he thought this in the pre-critical philosophy as well, saying that the idea of a causa sui is incoherent. So in sum, I think the challenge for Kant is different than we think. He can't meet the challenge by beginning with epistemology and reflecting on the conditions of the possibility of experience or cognition or the forms of judgment or something like that. He's got to offer a premise that rationalists will accept. He does that in his account of reason as interesting in conditioning, and he shows that having drunk from that chalice is poison to the rationalists' systematizing project. And so from this follows that the challenge for the post-Kantians is different than we would expect. The challenge of arguing immanently is not beginning with what Kant says in the aesthetic and the analytic, analyzing what we can know and building our way back from there to an account of an absolute that ties the system together. The challenge is to work on this thread of argument, especially D, where he sketches the antinomy contradictions. Engage imminently with that in defense of a Spinoza-like system. So I think the reason that we tend to read Kant in a way that begs the question against Kant is we haven't quite accepted what the central challenge for Hegel is. And the challenge is different than we would have thought. So, part 2. So then here's my hypothesis. I mean, there's not really a question of defending a complete account of Hegel's science of logic here, let alone even explaining the whole account of Hegel's science of logic, but I have something much more focused in mind. Let's say I'm right in this perhaps idiosyncratic weird idea about what the argumentative context is for Kant and for Hegel responding to Kant. Let's say the challenge is basically D and F above. How, and let's say we want to see how far we can get by trying to read the outlines, the familiar features, things that you already know about science of logic that I'll also talk about, Hegel's science of logic. We want to read those as engaging imminently with this line of argument in D and F in support of reviving a Spinoza-like metaphysical system. What would we say about the logic? We can test how crazy my hypotheses are by seeing if certain details about the science of logic easily fall into place in an appealing way once we try to see them as essentially trying to use things like D against Kant. And I think that this challenge, even though I've said the argumentative situation is different than we often assume, it doesn't mean that it's easy, right? So I sometimes see people talking in this way. I guess I should admit, to some degree, it can seem like I have talked this way in the past or too close to it for my own comfort now. It might seem when you look at D, how does Hegel deal with this challenge? D says, we try to think the unconditioned, we contradict ourselves, and therefore thought is limited. And it might seem obvious that the Hegelian response is something like, down below under 2 when I said it's not a solution. The Hegelian response is something like this. Look, the only way for reality to be completely intelligible is if reality is a self-developing totality driven by real contradictions. So the fact that Kant discovers contradictions in D when trying to think the unconditioned is not a complaint against thought or a reason to limit thought. Contradictions are real. Kant was just discovering what is real. And that may be Hegel's position, but this is not an adequate line of argument against Kant because it began by assuming what Kant has already argued against, namely that reality is completely intelligible, or that we can make reality completely intelligible. So this would be a fine destination to try to get to, but to argue in this way, I think, is still begging the question in the way, more or less, that Dusing thought his own reason for this begging the question. And furthermore, this is something that I definitely didn't appreciate the difficulty of in the past. I don't think there can be any question of just taking what Kant calls his experiment in D and re-executing the experiment and coming to a happier conclusion for Hegel, coming back to a Spinoza-style system. And the reason is that Kant has carefully built into the rules of the experiment what he claims are the ineliminable interests of reason, namely interest in one thing as conditioning another, or one thing as dependent on another. And I think that Hegel sees that when we build that into the rules of what thought is, we are going to come to the conclusion inevitably and correctly that thought is limited. So here's a version of Hegel seeding that. Here in particular, he's thinking of Jacobi, but the point I think applies nicely to Kant as well. If we take cognition and attentness, nur as a thoughtful following through a row of conditions to other conditions, well, immanent in that process, there's no way we could get to the infinite. There's no way we could get an absolute that would bind the system together. So I take that to mean that if we just rerun the experiment in D, allowing Kant to have set the rules, then we're still not going to get to an absolute. All right, so how could we do this thing? How could we try to read the science of logic? Just a sketch to begin, and then I'll try to fill some details in as actually responding, using the logic in D against Kant and in favor of revising a Spinoza-like metaphysical system. Well, I mean, I think the clue is, if we divide the logic into its 3 parts, doctrine of being, doctrine of essence, and of the concept, that the doctrine of essence does seem to be, and it's familiar to say that it is, all about forms of dependence or conditioning relations. Cause effect, part whole, ground grounded are central topics in the doctrine of essence. So here's how I would try to portray the science of logic. My initial sketch of the science of logic as quite precisely identifying the challenge as Kant's D and responding to it. And as I said, we can't just respond to D because Kant's built into the rules of the game, an interest in one thing conditioned by another, which is going to doom prospects of getting to an absolute. So what Hegel does to remain immanent to Kant, I think, is back up to the considerations in passage C. There, effectively, Kant says, insofar as we think anything at all, we'll find ourselves thinking about the metaphysics of conditioning or dependence. And then we're stuck with his experiment in D, where we find we cannot think the unconditioned without contradiction. And effectively, the way we would do this thing that I'm promising to try to do, to read the science of logic as structured by Kant's challenge, is to have Hegel just back up and say, Kant, it's fair to ask the reasons for passage C. Why would it be that insofar as we think anything at all, we always think the things that you say reason is interested in, namely conditions and the unconditioned? And the doctrine of being would be concerned with redefending, finding reasons for this thing that Kant takes as basic. So Doctrine of Being will consider what it's like if we think anything at all and try to argue that there is indeed some reason why metaphysics becomes obsessed with conditioning or dependence relations. And there's some reason we can discover just simply by trying to, in Kant's terms, think anything at all. However, the doctrine of essence will try to show that the need we discovered to think dependence, which seemed to be a need to think dependence or conditioning, or in terms of a metaphysics of dependence or conditioning, in fact was misperceived. And in fact, when we think it through, is actually a need to conceive everything else in terms of a cosmosui. So since we've discovered the reason why reason becomes interested in conditioning, and conditioning can't really serve that need, this form of philosophy is free to unattach from the metaphysics of dependence and rethink things in terms of a cosmosui. And that would be the job of the doctrine of the concept. So there's how I map out the three parts of Hegel's science of logic, just in terms of Kant's own passage C and passage D. So then, hypothetically, if you wanted to follow me on this journey, how would the doctrine of being fit? Well, it's not uncommon in the metaphysical tradition to recognize that before arguing, we're going to have access to something like being or existence. So we want to get on to normal philosophical arguments. They're going to go something like this. Well, there is normativity. There must be a source of normativity. What's the source of normativity? There are objects. They have this feature. There are these features of objects. How could they have these features of objects? The normative supervenes on the natural. There is a supervenience of the normative on the natural. How could that be? What could explain that? All of those employ the is. All of those are arguments that we're going to have access to thinking being before we even get going in the argument. And so it's kind of familiar in the tradition, things like Hegel's passage H, that to begin, before we get going with the other arguments we want to get to, the rational thing to conclude in this particular context is that we can simply think being through itself. Being is conceived, pure being is conceived through itself, without having presupposed any other distinction, like the being of minds and the being of world, or the being of objects and the being of concept, or the being of blue and red, or anything else. From there, of course, Hegel wants to generate this unusual, shocking conclusion that being is nothing. And the challenge here, given my setup in any case, if my setup is correct, is that the normal ways we might imagine him doing this, arguments that are natural and easy to understand, he cannot have access to. So sometimes I feel like people are thinking about Hegel like this. Hegel argues that nothing is determinate except insofar as it negates other things. And so being cannot be determinate, will merely be nothing, unless being negates something else, which I guess would be nothing in that case. But notice that that form of argument presupposes the principle that nothing is determinate except as negating other things. And that's a kind of axiom of dependence. It's not far from the rationalist principle of sufficient reason. It says anything depends for its determinacy on something else. That's not something Hegel can assume from the beginning. It is something I think he would recognize would doom his prospects. That's a form of the poison chalice. So how can Hegel argue it all without arguing in this way? Here's the thing, what are its conditions or causes or grounds? Well, surprisingly, I think Hegel has a way that's rooted in Kant's own antinomy style argument from the Dialectic that he's sketching in deep. So here's a comparison. I think of dialectical argument as a kind of context switching. So here's the comparison. Kant thinks when we're in a natural philosophical context, we have not engaged yet with arguments for transcendental idealism, which are highly unusual and new. We're just naturally philosophically thinking. The arguments of the antinomy are good. They work. And I don't think that Kant gives this up. You start doing philosophy, there's nothing wrong with the arguments for the antinomy contradictions, both the arguments that substances must reduce to simples and the argument that substances can't reduce to simples. It's when we observe the contradiction, that the antinomy arguments contradict one another, it puts us in another philosophical context. And there we see the need to stop, let go of that, and rethink it all in terms of something else that we start with, namely transcendental idealism. It's odd that Kant has this shocking form, unusual form of dialectical argument. It doesn't seem to me to fit the pattern of how Kant himself says reason works. And so it's a nice thing that Hegel can borrow from Kant to contest the way in which Kant sometimes says reason forces us to think, would poison the prospects for a system. So the comparison in Hegel is this: in the context of trying to begin philosophy, the correct conclusion to draw is that being is conceivable through itself, pure being. However, drawing that conclusion for that reason puts us in a new context from which we can appreciate the famous problem that such pure being conceived through itself would be completely empty and essentially nothing, as the famous passage I says. And then we would read the logic as attempting to argue in this context switching way all the way through from being to nothing to becoming and so on. Of course, he recognizes that people want to resist the initially crazy claim that being is nothing. And it's important for us to think about the resistances. And what he has to say at this point in the logic is simply that someone who resists what he wants to do faces this demand in passage J. They just have to give their own account of what it is to be, the nature of being. If they can give one that distinguishes it from nothing, then he's happy to let this identity go. But as for Hegel, he thinks the only way to approach the question of what it is to be is to follow it through the identification of being with nothing and on to becoming, etc. And as for the rest of the doctrine of being, the idea, if we start in the way that I have, would be something like this: the more we try to think determinate being, that wouldn't just be nothing, the more we find ourselves face to face with forms of dependence. So I've got one of them in passage K. We're trying to think and determine something, but we find that it only is what it is in something else. It depends on something else for its being what it is. And by the end of the doctrine of being, we have generated the conclusion that it's supposed to be good, at least in this context, that you cannot, to return to the language of Kant's passage C, you cannot think anything at all without thinking it through, first thinking some kind of dependence. Okay, so how would the doctrine of essence fit? I've just said the end of being is a context in which it's justified to conclude that thinking anything at all requires thinking through dependence relations. And here's just an example of how you would then conceive being. If you were doing this, if you're thinking that we can't conceive or account for what it is of being without thinking in terms of dependence, for example, causality, then you might investigate as one possible conclusion the Eleatic principle: to be is to have causal power. That's a way of thinking being itself through a dependence relation. And then, of course, we get the famous problems of the doctrine of essence, which I'll just summarize by saying how they look from the perspective of the line I'm taking. So one form of problem would be we'd ask, the question is, what is it to be as opposed to not be? We're going to account for this in terms of a dependence relation like grounding. We'd have to ask, what is it to be a ground as opposed to a grounded? Or what is it to be a cause as opposed to an effect? And if we're really trying to conceive ground or causality through itself, then the only thing to say is that to be a cause is to have an effect, or to be a ground is to have a grounded. And if we do that, we get the kind of contradiction Kant was interested in D, because we've said that the ground depends on the grounded, or the cause, in fact, depends on the effect. And that's a way of learning that these dependence relations, while we had a good reason to reach for them, we identified a genuine need to account for being, and in that context, it was legitimate, it's justified to conclude that we're going to have to look to dependence relations. Because of these problems in the doctrine of essence, we should actually conclude that dependence can't do what we had hoped it could do. It cannot resolve that need. But note now how different of a context we would be in as compared to the way Kant thought of it. Kant thinks reason just can't but be interested in conditioning or dependence relations. So when we meet these contradictions, there's no alternative but to limit the extent of reason, critique of reason, that will limit us, make us fall short of being able to revive a Spinoza style metaphysical system. But Hegel has backed up to Kant's passage C and really accounted for the need that sends us toward thinking in terms of dependence relations, that makes the history of metaphysics addicted, as it were. Jacobi has this nice phrase, Erklärungssucht, which I like to think is a kind of addiction to explanatory relationships. And we've explained the need that produces this addiction to dependence relations. So without assuming dependence relationships to beginning or axioms for them like principle of sufficient reason. And so we're free to conclude that what philosophy initially perceives as a need to think in terms of dependence is actually an unclear perception of something else, namely a need to think in terms of a causal zooey of some kind. So you can see in passage toward the end of the Doctrine of Essence, like I have L on the handout, that Hegel takes the failures of thinking causality just through the causal relation of one thing and another just through itself, to demonstrate that if there's any, let's put it this way, hypothetically, if there's a truth to causality, it's going to have to be found in the causal zooey. If there's a way to conceive of causality, it won't be conceiving causality through itself, but conceiving causality through a kind of self-cause. And here he again mentions Jacobi, but I think the point applies to Kant as well. If you're a philosopher who's so attached to thinking in terms of one thing conditioned by another thing, then you won't be able to take the causal zooey seriously metaphysically. But Hegel's re-executed the experiment in a way that opens the door to realizing a different lesson, namely that we have to at least try to think a causal zooey. And so on this account, of course, that would be the job of the doctrine of the concept. We have re-executed C and D from Kant in such a way that we've opened the door to realizing that what philosophy really wants when it reaches for causality or grounding is rather a kind of causal zooey, but we haven't accounted for a causal zooey. We haven't demonstrated an account of one. That's a different matter, and that would be the real job of the doctrine of the concept. I take it that here are where the radical conclusions follow in Hegel. And as I said at the beginning, I'm aware that these are not conclusions that are taken particularly seriously in philosophy today, but that for me is part of my point, is trying to recover some reasons that might send us in some extreme directions. So I take it that the resolution of these problems comes in the absolute idea section at the end of the logic, when Hegel reflects on method that he's pursued all along in the science of logic. And the idea is something like this. We've been thinking in this dialectical or context-switching way, and that has generated all this content for us, being, nothing, becoming, etc. We didn't have a presupposition. We just argued for the need to start with being, and from there we argued for the successive steps. So thinking has given itself content, the content of these distinct steps in the progression. And in that sense, it's thinking, process of thinking that we've been following along, that is a causal zooey. It makes itself what it is. It gives itself its own content. So one way of expressing this is using the term the concept, not just any concept, but the concept. I think he uses it here for the concept of thought, or the concept of the object of the logic. And so in passage M, he says, we're now observing this method. It's the method of the movement of the concept. In a way, we've been familiar with this all along, because it's been moving us all along through these arguments in the logic, from being to nothing, etc. But now we can draw two more conclusions from it, and I'll start with the second. The second is that this movement is itself a kind of absolute activity. It's self-determining and self-realizing. reflecting on the method and the progress of the logic gives us the form of kausazui that it turned out we are now more correctly perceiving was what we needed all along, specifically in the sense of it's something that makes itself what it is. Insofar as the moving force through all this, what got us going was a problem about being. What is it to be? That was we were unable to solve purely in terms that considered in Doctrine of Being, and then later in terms of the Doctrine of Essence. If that's the moving problem, and if this is a solution, then the ultimate view is going to be that to be is to be a form of the self-determination of thought, this radical form of metaphysical idealism, kind of idealist metaphysical system. You might express that in a couple ways. For example, passage M says the other thing we realize at the end is that the concept is everything. Because to be anything at all would be to be a form of the concept of thought. And another way is in the idea that the idea is a kind of identity of the concept that we've been discussing and reality. Now, while that's super radical, this radical form of metaphysical idealism, to be is to be a form of self-realizing thought, I don't think it's so radical that it eliminates the existence of anything finite. Rather, I think the view is that to be finite is to be an incomplete form of the self-determination of thought. So here in passage O, he says that finite things are things that are not completely determined by a concept within them, unlike thought. They're incomplete forms of it. And so we could follow this now further into the real philosophy and say things like, well, is there mechanism? Well, yes, there's mechanism. Mechanistic phenomena are a form of this kind of complete self-determination. To be a mechanistic phenomenon is to rotate around the center of gravity. That's a form of self-determining system, just not a completely self-determining system. Is there life? Yes, life more completely determines itself, and it's reproducing itself, more so than mechanism, but still an incomplete form of the self-determination of thought. Now look, of course, I've just proposed that to be is to be a form of the self-determination of thought. And there's an obvious objection, which is that that is obviously not true. The being is obviously not thought, or so says the objector, that it just seems so completely obvious. And what I want to do here is suggest that the form of argument we followed suggests that that objection, while there might be something to it, has a higher cost than would normally be recognized when a philosopher today makes that objection. So what a philosopher today wants to say when they make that objection is, you've just said Hegel thinks that to be is to be a form of self-determining thought. That's clearly false. So I know now that I don't need to read any more Hegel, and I can go back to doing whatever argument I was doing before. There is normativity, it must have a source, or whatever I was doing. But I think this line of argument I followed in Hegel has some potential to put pressure on this boring form of the objection that wants to go back to philosophy as usual. And the reason is that as an engagement with Hegel, there's now pressure on the objector to do one of two things. One thing would be to offer an alternative to Hegel's account of what it is to be, to defend an alternative on which being is not thought. That is, if you want to say, obviously being is not thought, though you're inviting the question, what then is being? Just the demand that Hegel talked about back in, was it passage J? No, I can't recall. So you could try to answer that, but now you're clearly playing Hegel's game, right? And you might be tempted to say, oh, I can say what being is. To be is to whatever, X, right? But of course, Hegel's within his rights at that point to say, what is X? And until and unless you come to something that is conceived through itself, another kind of kausazui to compete with Hegel's, he's not going to have to stop asking you that question. So at this point, as an objection to Hegel, one thing that may happen to you is you may get sucked into playing Hegel's game. And in a lot of traditions, what philosophers discover when they try to oppose Hegel and end up under pressure to play Hegel's game is it's hard to beat Hegel at Hegel's game. If you say, well, I can account for what it is to be is to be a cause, then we can flip to that section of the logic and see if you can give an account of causality that won't succumb to Hegel's objection to that as an account of what it is to be. Now, I don't mean there's no way out of all this. what I think actually is there's an obvious way out of that challenge, the danger of being forced to play Hegel's game. And the obvious way is to say that we immediately know what being is. And when we immediately know what being is, we immediately know that it's not thought. All right, so you can see forms of this, for example, of people objecting to Bishop Berkeley by kicking a rock, was that the famous one, and saying, that's how I know that Berkeley is wrong about his idealism. Effectively saying, we don't need to give a demonstration or a definition. We know that being is not thought. But this seems to me to also lead in a very radical direction and not back to philosophy as usual. Because when we say that, what we're saying is before we do philosophy, we have an immediate grasp of what being or existence is. This is very much in the more radical critic Jacobi would like this line of thought, and I think later it's advanced by Kierkegaard following Jacobi. What happens if we consistently go down that path is what we're effectively saying is the absolute authority for philosophy is never something we establish in arguments in philosophy. It's always something that's there prior to the arguments that we know immediately. And we cannot at that point go back to arguments from normativity to a source of normativity, because the source of normativity is something that we know eludes definition and argument from the very beginning. Maybe it's more like a Kierkegaardian leap. You can get out, so the idea is you can easily get out of Hegel if you're willing to go down that radical path. Not so easy, apparent to me, how you get out of Hegel and get back to philosophy as you were doing it before anyone bothered you to engage. With Hegel, now I'm aware that contemporary philosophers will simply think, well, we don't have to go radically in one direction or the other because we can balance these kind of concerns. I think contemporary philosophers think of this as balancing intuitions as a form of immediacy with kinds of systematic concerns. But this seems in light of the kind of argument that Hegel's giving and the other German idealists as well, Kant and Jacobi, pretty naive. So I just would ask someone who says, let's moderately balance, including the intuition that being is not thought, how they know where the right balance point to balance these things is. If it's something we can argue about, then we're effectively under pressure to go back to Hegel's game. We need an argument that tells us which intuitions about being to admit as the good ones. And effectively, we need an argument to demonstrate what it is to be if we're consistent. Direction, I think, was pursued more consistently by Jacobi and later by Kierkegaard. So coming to conclusion, can Hegel defend a metaphysical system immanently? What I said at the beginning was the way to see how would be to recognize the relevant Kantian challenge is different than we expect. It's not reflection on the conditions of the possibility of knowledge, but the argument of Kant's dialectic, which effectively offers the system builder metaphysical dependence and lets it poison the project of metaphysical system building. And if we do that, we can then see the logic as structured right along the lines of Kant's C and D, but in order to oppose Kant. So one thing it would be borrowing from Kant is this idea of a context switching form of argument rather than an argument that regresses to conditions, grounds, or causes of things. And the other would be to back up and find a problem motivating Kant's own C, the claim that to think anything at all, we need to think conditioning or dependence. And then that opens the door to seeing when dependence doesn't solve the problem, but produces contradictions, not that thought is limited, but that thinking in terms of dependence doesn't solve the need that it was posited for, and rather the need was for something else, a kind of kazazui that same line of thinking could generate. I'll skip the doctrine of essence for time, and I'll just pose one more challenge to my way of doing things. You might think, I think sometimes people think that I'm saying that Hegel's going back, he just found a way back to Spinoza. And yet, really, of course, in Hegel, there's radical criticism of Spinoza. And it's quite clear in Hegel that he thinks rethinking things in Spinoza in light of Kant changes Spinoza, leads to something very new, not just to going backwards. And so you might think, is my account, as it were, too much Hegel just going backwards? Can I not make sense of something new in the criticism of Spinoza? But I think I can in these terms. So Spinoza begins with the concept of substance as cause of itself. These concepts, no matter how deep and correct they are just assumed. He tries to build something into thought from the beginning that would render the rest of it conditioned on that beginning point. If we're going to get an absolute, we're going to have to demonstrate one in a course of thinking. And that's what I've tried to show how what Hegel's trying to do. So that's to say the form of argument in Hegel would be very different than Spinoza. No axioms, no definitions, but rather beginning with a lack of presuppositions. And the new form of argument turns out itself to be thought, which turns out to be Hegel's absolute. And that would show how arguing in a different way demonstrates a new kind of metaphysical system, much more radically idealist than Spinoza had. And so that's how I come to my conclusion that it's worth trying to think through. There's actually some prospect of reading Hegel as radically trying to revive a Spinoza kind of metaphysics, yet arguing all the way through imminently in relation to Kant. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim, for the rich and insightful thought. So we have some time for discussion. But either you're here, if you want to ask questions online, you can raise your hand or type the question in the chat. Okay. I open the floor. Giovanni.
Thank you for your presentation. I just have some concern with your position between Kant and Hegel. It seems to me that I agree with you when you say that the main concern Kant critical pure reason is the problem of metaphysics, is the problem to, in some way, give a legitimate solution to a desire that reason inevitable or going beyond experience. But it seems to me that the Kant solution it is not just accepting that we are our knowledge is limited to experience. It's almost the opposite. The problem that Kant had with metaphysics, it was a sort of heteronomy that metaphysics had, that dogmatic metaphysics had. So, and what Kant discovered is the very notion of autonomy or pure reason. So reason has to do only with itself. It is the only source of its legislation in the field of experience, and also in the field that goes beyond experience, that it is freedom. No? So it seems to me that the problem that Hegel has with Kant's notion of reason is not that it's limited, it's that it's too abstract, because it's unable to in a sense, to understand the dialectical relation between the subject and the object. Doesn't have, in a certain sense, doesn't allow objectivity to respond back to towards a subjectivity and changes subjectivity in a sense. So this is my concern. So it's quite the opposite, that Kantian metaphysics is too metaphysical and it is unable to go beyond itself. This seems to me. And then I have another question, which is just it's not really related to the topic. It's just a methodological question. You started by saying that we should let the past speak to us, so be the past, be the past. And it doesn't seem to be this like sort of anti-Hegelian task. So with Hegel, we make the past speak to us. So we keep changing the past and let it speak to us. I don't know.
Well, that's very nice. Thank you. I should have said before beginning, I feel bad for making people speak English. I don't know if anyone prefers German, but I'm happy with questions in German as well. That's better. Me, io parlo solo un po' italiano. Am I getting better every time I say that? Okay, so to the first point, I'm not sure how much farther, it's a great suggestion, so I'm not sure how much farther I'll get than I don't see it that way, but yeah, I tend to think, so on your way of thinking, the way that you proposed it, there's not a very, in Kant, there's not, it seemed to minimize the distinction between the theoretical and practical in Kant, insofar as what you thought the key thought was reason as autonomously legislating for itself, both in experience, you said, and beyond experience in the case of freedom. So I think both the way that Hegel sees it, and really the way that it is in Kant. Again, I should back up and say, it's not a matter of what I want as the best philosophical position, as much as what I think Kant is doing and what I tend to learn from Kant might be an attractive philosophical position. There's this radical distinction between the theoretical and the practical cases, where we've got to, the only hope to make room for reason as self-legislating in the case of freedom and practical philosophy is to radically limit reason in the sphere of the theoretical. And so we get things like the famous, in order to make room for Glaube, had to deny knowledge. So to me, that's really key, and the sense of limitation is really key to what Kant is doing. Now, this doesn't change the fact, of course, that Kant has, as you point out, that we would agree still, that Kant has in the practical realm this idea of reason legislating for itself. And you might think it's another objection or a different form of your objection to me to say, shouldn't we rather say Hegel is building on that account of reason legislating for itself? Or, and then criticizing it as too abstract and looking for a way to play that out in a way that's less abstract. And I think I need to think for a better way of integrating your suggestion, your focus on this critique of Kant as having an orientation and self-legislation of reason, but in a way that leaves it too abstract. And as you put it, I can see the resonances of this for Hegel, too metaphysical in that sense. But I think what I'm going to try to do in the fullness of time to adequately answer what you suggested is to relate these two things together. That is, on my account, it's going to be that precisely because Kant had to limit the theoretical side in order to make room for reason self-legislating on the practical side, that forced him in a direction on the practical side that was merely abstract. That is, where he couldn't execute these two things in relation, bring freedom into relation with thought about experience and things like that. That doomed him to the abstractness of the practical side as he saw it. But that's just a promise for future. As I said in the past, I always get great questions in Padova that have very slowly, I think it was Federico Orsini asked me one the first time I came, and we still can't remember when this was, 2011, that I think I did not ever figure out until the other year why he was right and I was wrong. And yours is probably going to be one credit with that. The next book after this one will have some influence, or maybe still listen to it. Thank you. Oh, there was a methodological thing. Sorry. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think? I see the resonance of what you're saying with the way Hegel speaks, but note the way I put it, it is a way of trying to make the past speak to us. It's trying to, when we do history of philosophy, we're trying to make the past speak to us in a way that's useful for us. And if we just make the past repeat what we think we already know, or the orthodoxy today, then of course we've rendered it useless for dialectical purposes. We've stunted the dialectic that's trying to move us forward. And just as one example, I do think of Hegel's, the way Hegel looks back at Aristotle in just this way. He does read Aristotle as more similar to his own theory than it probably is, but he doesn't read Aristotle's metaphysics as similar to early modern metaphysics, because that would render it useless for his purposes. He looks to Aristotle for something he thinks is better than early modern metaphysics, Descartes, say, or Wolff as well, in order to power thought forward to something that's new and no longer in either of the two things of the past. So that's how I prefer to think of my methodology.
Okay. Next on the list is Karen.
Sorry, but there's also Elena.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Elena, I didn't see your hand. I kept looking at the chat and I didn't look at the. Sorry.
So ich bin is it my turn or now I?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I didn't notice your hand.
Thanks. Thank you also, Karen, for thank you, Jim, for the talk. Hi. It was super interesting, and it's actually very interesting to see the sequel or the prequel to what we just saw in Berlin with such a few distance. So thanks. I have quite a few questions. I'll keep them to one line, and hopefully they're gonna be clear. So my first question is, if you think that the question, what is being, is the same question as what it is to be, then my second question would be, so you said that in the end for Hegel, to be is to be a form of thought. And I would like to ask you, what exactly is this? So what do you mean? What do you think this thought is exactly? So is it our own thought, or is it something more? And then my other question is connected, I would say, to this last one, the way I see it. If I understand you right, we can say that Kant's legacy for Hegel is having demonstrated that the way of doing metaphysics through the conditioned and unconditioned is a no-go in a way. I would like to ask you if you think that Kant's legacy towards Hegel could also be related to Hegel's choice of doing his metaphysics in the form of a logic. And if you think so, in what term, what is Kant's role there? Or if he has no role, that's also okay. And then I ask two very small questions, kind of external questions, I'm sorry. I hope this doesn't sound like too much. These are really just external questions. So I would like to ask you, what's the connection for you between, so to say, a monistic out view and system building? Because this sounds really central to your account. And I think you said a few things in this direction, but I wanted to hear a little bit more, because I think Kant, in a way, was not against the system building in general, but for sure it wouldn't have been for a monistic outlook, or at least the way Hegel presented it. And the very last point, as you know, I'm very sympathetic with this idea of avoiding choosing a contemporary view and then forcing it on Hegel. So in a way, I don't like readings of Hegel that make him timely in this way. But then it seems you just want to go in the direction, like, I don't care about the question of Hegel's timeliness. So I wanted to ask you if this is like this for you, or in a way, as it seems to me by the looks of your talk, you think that this untimeliness of Hegel could in a way provide a contribution. And in that case, if you could make your references in the contemporary philosophy more explicit. Thank you, and I hope this is not too many points. Thanks.
Wow. One thing I want to say to Elena is it's interesting to hear your series of questions as a kind of sequel to your questions that you asked me the other day in Berlin. All right. Do I think that the question of what is being is the same as the question of what it is to be? That has the ring of an important question to me that I haven't managed to understand yet. So I'm going to say yes, experimentally, until and unless someone tells me what I do expect to hear sometime, some reason that I should be more careful about that. But I haven't seen it yet, but it sounds like there's probably something there. To be is to be a form of thought. What is this thought? Is it ours? Well, I mean, it's pretty clear that the idea is going to be more radical than would allow me to say that this form of thought is ours. Because you might back up and say, what is it to be us? And of course, what I've promised on behalf of Hegel is to explain what we are in terms of this form of thought, right? We are a thing that's capable of being, that's capable of pursuing, of making a current to ourselves this line of thought. But there's a priority of this thought over us, just like everything else. So I really don't want any kind of deflationary or reducing being or thought or anything else to what we can think or what I have thought along this path. So it's radical and it's odd, and it's going to occasion, of course, questions like you have told me you often get, which is like, oh, where is this thought then if it's not our thought? And what you have to carefully do is back up and unpack the assumptions in the question, which is like, it's got to be either in a mind or in the world, and explain why philosophy needs to some resources that to get going prior to that distinction that other people are just assuming, or as I was saying at the end, other people are just taking it as intuitively obvious. And then my way, as I showed you at the end, is to say, look, I'm not opposed to you taking these things to be intuitively obvious, but it's going to drag you in a radical philosophical direction of Jacobi and Kierkegaard, where most people who are asking you where is thought really don't want to go. All right, Kant's legacy, having shown the demonstration in this way is a no-go. I love that way of putting it. Could Kant's legacy also be related to Hegel's choice to advance this in the form of logic. What is Kant's role there? I'm not quite sure what the best, I mean, if there was a motivation like that for Hegel, it would kind of have to be one still, I mean, the part where he speaks that way, most that way to me, would be the, what is it called? The concept in general. At the beginning of the doctrine of the concept. And strictly speaking, that stuff is going to have to follow what came before. So I think officially the methodology of what we're doing prior to that in a book that's already at that point called Logic is going to have to be free of that kind of Kantian motivation. So what we do in the first two parts is generate some reason to focus more on thought or thought self-reflectiveness or something like that. So there has to be a sense of doing a logic that's prior to that more Kantian direction that we eventually turn in. So that's why I kind of would resist that way of thinking. So I sort of think of it, you know, I would think that I could think of it just as well as Spinozist insofar as the question is, what is conceived through what? And when we think about that in Spinoza, we're thinking of it as really a purely metaphysical project and not especially Kantian for sure. Oh gosh, I don't know. Oh, good, that was, then you said I have two small questions, and the first one was the one I worried I forgot, which is, of course, Kant's into system building, totally true. I need to find a way to, is the difference there that Hegel's into monistic system building? And yeah, I don't think so, because I'm not inclined. I realize that would be nice in this context, but I'm not inclined to hang a lot on monism for Hegel. I sort of feel like for my Hegel, it's not quite the right question, because of course for Spinoza, you have the inherence relation, and you have, I now can't remember if it's axiom 1 or 2 in the first part of the ethics, which is anything that's not in something else is in itself. And of course, you have a defense of the position that everything is in substance, which is in itself. And this inness makes it really clearly a monistic view. But I don't think, for reasons related to my talk, that Hegel's investing a lot in an inherence relation and axioms for an inherence relation, like what's not in another is in itself, from the beginning of the logic. So I feel like, you know, yeah, it's kind of monistic, what he ends up with, but it's not everything is in one thing. And I wouldn't want to hang a lot on saying this is monism, because I wouldn't want to tie him to the inherence relation in that respect. And so the pressure is on me to say in what respect Kant is obviously obsessed with system building. It's quite annoying sometimes when you're reading him. Yet, as I put it, a critic of system building. But I guess what I come back to, I just don't, I need to do better at what sense in which Kant is committed to system building. But it seems quite clear to me, and the reason that Kant is committing show that we can't make everything explicable or intelligible. So in whatever sense he's building a system, it's not going to involve everything being explicable or intelligible, at least in the way that Hegel would like to show that it is, namely that for everything we can completely explain the what it is of that thing. For me, Kant's got limits there, and so system building is more a matter of arranging the elements, even though some of them are more about our limitation. Okay, final, tiny, small question. Avoiding contemporary, is it that I don't care about timeliness, or is it that untimeliness could find contribution? I prefer that untimeliness could provide contribution, but here I guess I see it in a sort of really shallow sense of dialectical. I mean, you need to not care about contemporary philosophy in order to spend the time just thinking things through in their own terms. So there has to be an element of, I just don't care what's timely. I mean, I often find that. I thought, you know, in the States, things are such that I often get people asking me like, oh, you studied Hegel, you know, what did you think of McDowell's last book? And I'm like, yeah, I haven't read McDowell's last book because I'm busy reading Jacobi, which is something that Hegel himself read, unlike McDowell. So sometimes it manifests for me as I just don't care. But ultimately, I am interested in this looking back as a way to power us forward to something different. And then, of course, I do have to engage, as you're pointing out. But I think in the spirit of this is a small question, I can't quite provide the references here in response to your request for them. But fortunately, you and I had a conversation the other day about Schaffer and the metaphysics of grounding, which is where I would begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay. Now, the next on the list is Karen.
Thank you. Yes,
thanks so much for your talk. I have two questions, and okay, the first one is also about Kant's legacy, and I agree that the dialectics play a really big role also for Hegel, and you suggested that we should read the logic through the lens of the dialectics, or Hegel's critique on the dialectics, and I was wondering what kind of role does the third critique plays in your account, especially the idea, for example, of intuitive understanding, because Hegel was also a big fan of this, and can you somehow integrate it or tell a story about what Hegel does with this idea? And also the propositiveness theme, maybe you can integrate it because you talk of self-determination, and then maybe it's more easy to integrate this.
Yeah.
So that's the first question, and the second one is actually kind of the same question I had last Friday, and I tried to put it now in more like a clear way, or at least I try. If not, I have another opportunity to ask the question again in June. So let's see. I'm still wondering how, on your account, the three doctrines of the logic relate to each other. Mm-hmm. So last time you said, okay, it's not like we don't throw being away, and also we don't throw essence away or cause or something, and we just have the doctrine of the concept. But you said what Hegel is doing is, or like that's the way I understood you, is telling a story that we have to conceive being in another way than it is conceived in the Doctrine of Being. We have to go to the Doctrine of Essence, try to conceive being through relation, and then we end up with the self-determination in the Doctrine of Concept. So there is some kind of transformation. We keep being, but we conceive it through another way. Okay. So, and that would mean that in the end, everything in reality is self-determination. Everything in reality is somehow governed by the dialectics of development. Maybe that's something like this. And the question I raised last time, I maybe put in not such a clear way, was that in the Doctrine of Being there is like something you call dialectics of transition or something like that. Doctrine of Essence, you have the dialectics of relation, and then you have the dialectics of development. And so I was wondering, does this your account suggest that in reality there is no dialectic of transition anymore? Like some phenomenon I'm thinking of, that something where there's a lot of quantity turns into quality. And I thought maybe we want to have some kind of relationship still in reality, and maybe Kant if we take something like this. So I don't know if this was clear now. I hope so.
Well, let me give it a try. So first of all, can I just back up to the first questioner? I didn't catch your name, and I've forgotten if we met. Giovanna. So your first question about third critique is, if I had been smarter, what I would have said to Giovanna. So like, here's my Hegel story about how the third critique goes. Kant has realized that he said something really different in the theoretical case in the first critique than he said in the practical case in the second critique, with respect to the topic Giovanna raised, namely reason legislating for itself, namely reason is radically limited in the theoretical case and not so in the practical case. And then the idea of the third critique would be that Kant realizes what goes wrong here, which, as I promised Giovanna, I would like to account for this being the reason that in the practical case turns out to be so indeterminate. And thus, what Kant realized in the third critique is that he has to provide some, what do you call it? Do you call it a bridge between these two things? Or in order to, so that the teeth of freedom would catch on something determinate in nature. And so that would be a sort of imminent Kant's own system, realizing what had gone wrong when we have such a radical separation of practical and theoretical. And then the rest of the things that Hegel likes about the third critique would be indications or hints of where Kant would have focused or would have begun had he not instead started in this way that pulls the practical and theoretical apart. And so we get a basic, stronger emphasis on propositiveness, especially in the case of life, which of course for Hegel becomes the first form of the idea. And indeed, we would not get an insistence on theoretical limit with respect to the perspective of an intuitive understanding, but we would have to integrate that into the system in some way. Now, I think this is complicated for reasons to do with Hegel's relationship with Friedrich and Schelling, that he doesn't think we can start with the intuitive understanding, but we have to somehow non-intuitively demonstrate a way that gets us to that. That's in a way the whole big problem for Hegel, but it is a good indication of where we would have to get to. So I find that very helpful. Hopefully Jivan is more satisfied now that I used your question to answer hers. Point 2, a better answer about how the three doctrines relate. I see your question now. So what you're calling transition is this Übergehen.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Yes, and there should still be Übergehen in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the best thing for me to say is here. I mean, strictly speaking, my head thought, and you may well tell me that there's a reason not to say this, but my thought would have been, strictly speaking, what he means by Übergehen there is he's naming the problem that continually emerges in being. So, for example, what was the passage that I had in passage K? This is going to be a sort of early form of this Übergehen. We try to look to the something for determinateness, and we find that the something is only what it is in its limit that separates it from its other, and it's gone over, as it were, into its other. And the fact that we keep going over in this way is what indicates that we can't resolve the question we've discovered is important, namely what is being, in terms of being, but rather we then have to think in terms of relation. So that would be how my story goes. And so strictly speaking, in that logical sense, as it were, Übergehen names a philosophical problem. And of course, there's no more problem, so we accounted for the absolute. So that's gone away. But of course, he does kind of insistently, maybe metaphorically, I don't know what you think about it, tie the logical problem of Übergehen to real phenomenon, which strictly speaking are not the topic of the logic, but this is going to map on to some things in reality because he maps it on to some things perishing, dying, or being destroyed and going away. And of course, he really wants to save room for all that in the Doctrine of Essence. So I guess I'd look for a balance there where strictly speaking, logically, this was a problem which got solved in later parts of the logic, but this is going to contribute to whatever sense we can make nature intelligible, to our making nature intelligible in terms of real phenomena that correspond to the same problem, right? Because it was a problem in the logic, we were not rendering completely intelligible what being is, and we go on. What we want in the philosophy of nature is to make sense of real phenomena that are in fact not completely intelligible. So it may not be surprising that the real phenomena map on to what, strictly speaking, for the logic was a problem to be solved that got solved. If there are real phenomena that correspond to them, those are things whose problem doesn't get solved, as it were. They're only incompletely intelligible. That's the Ohnmacht der Natur, and things like that. Yeah, I can see that it's a great line of questioning, and there may still be more to say. It's up to the chair.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Because first I thought that maybe or like I had the worry that maybe you are then committed to say something like, okay, and what there really is just self-determination. And everything is like a form, maybe a deficient form, but a form of self-determination. And then I was like, okay, but somehow we want to say that there are also Übergänge in reality. And I think if you can, like the way you put it now, like capturing this as your Ohnmacht der Natur, I think I would like that. Because then you would have to say something like, they are then maybe not that.
No, but I think that they also have to be forms of self-determination, just very, very incomplete forms. So I go back to that passage where finite things, I'm sorry, did I cut you off? I didn't mean to keep you from going further.
No.
Very incomplete forms. So their concept is mostly external to them. And that makes them very incomplete forms of self-determination. And for Hegel, though fortunately it's not quite my job here to make sense of the philosophy of nature, that's going to be related to the sense that they perish. They go on that cannot preserve themselves. But I still think there are forms of self-determination. Very, very poor ones. You think of the solar system. In the sense it is self-determinating. It keeps itself rotating, as it were, but it's so indeterminate. It doesn't give itself determinate content. There's no way that mechanistic thinking is adequate to it, but doesn't tell us that there's any primitive way to carve up the solar system into parts that each have some sort of independent self-preservation over and against the others, which is why life will be in some complete form. I mean, we have a story about mechanism and between it, as you know, but that's what it's in.
Thanks.
Okay. I have 5 more people on the list. The first one is Luca.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for the lecture. And I wanted to ask you something about the notion of contradiction. It seems to me that this notion has a sort of a pivotal role in your account, but a focal role in your account, but I'm not sure I understood what you think about the notion of contradiction. The first thing is that for Kant, contradiction is not merely an error, an accident. For Kant, contradiction is something necessary for reason. And when Kant says that contradiction is something necessary, he says in a certain sense that contradiction is something real for reason. As a reason cannot avoid contradiction. And in this sense, it has a reality, the contradiction. It is a reality only for reason and not for reality, so to say, but it has a sort of reality. For Hegel, they are not only a question for thought, but they are real, you told. What does it mean that they are real? Does it mean that they are true, as that contradiction are true? And if so, are you thinking contradiction in a way similar to the dialectic reading in that way, or in another way, that they are true and real? I think there are, so to say, different readings about this notion of contradiction. For example, one of the first American who studied Hegel, Finlay, thought that contradiction is a sort of metaphor for all it has the form of a conflict. And so it is not a logical contradiction. There are others that think that for Hegel, contradiction has a similar role than for Kant, in the sense that contradiction is a contradiction only for the understanding, but not for reason. That understanding contradicts itself, but when we arrive to the realm of reason, when we arrive to the realm of absolute, there is no more contradiction. And there are someone who thinks that the absolute itself is contradictory for Hegel. So what is your position about the notion of contradiction in your account here?
Thank you very much. That's a great thing to push me on. Since I used Karen to answer Giovanna, I may use what I said there too to answer part of what you asked. But first, let me just describe the sense in which I think this is a tough problem, and pretty much a tough problem for everyone. And difficult.
Okay.
And I think, as I think of it, the reason is this. It seems clear to me that it's the discovery of contradictions as the dialectic proceeds that powers the progress of the dialectic. So there must be some sense in which, for Hegel, when we discover a contradiction, it tells us that, you know, where we are maybe right in some respect, but it's not the full picture. There's something missing. So there is, in fact, something going wrong. But the more we make sense of this way in which dialectic powers, in which contradiction powers dialectic, the more we tie ourselves to the view you just gave, which is that what's going wrong is we're thinking from the perspective of the understanding, and the contradictions power us toward the perspective of reason. And then, of course, that methodology suggests that when we get to the perspective of reason, there can't be contradictions anymore. Otherwise, we wouldn't be at the end. We wouldn't have, so that there's something right about that understanding of the methodology but there's something that's not quite right about what it commits us to about there being no real contradictions in the end. Because it's quite a clear theme, also with respect to the response to Kant, that Kant was missing something about the reality of contradictions. On the other hand, I think if you recognize, if you just say there are real contradictions, then it's, to my mind, very difficult to make sense of the methodology of dialectic and why, when we discover contradictions, we don't just say, oh yeah, we discovered something real. And what would be the next step in the dialectic? Oh, let's look somewhere else. Oh, there's a contradiction too. It seems to turn it into, I don't know, some kind of empirical methodology of just looking around for. So that seems to be a very difficult balance for everyone to draw. That's just a plea to have mercy on them for not having a super sophisticated story to tell. But I think I want to tell a story that's similar to something that I said to Karen, which is that in the context of the logic, there's a specific series of questions. He's argued at the beginning this very serious question, what is being? And when we discover contradictions in our answer to it, that's reason to think we don't have a good, complete answer to it yet, and we have to look on to something else in order to better answer it. And then from this perspective, the perspective of this methodology and the logic, when we get the absolute idea, I think we have, in a sense, overcome the contradictions. We have a perspective now which is not in contradiction with itself, that does answer the question. Now, it's not that we've gotten rid of the contradictions, right? Because the answer is that if we look at all these stages arranged in terms of this method of contradicting ourselves and moving on, the contradictions remain as the thing that power the transitions, and so in a way that's power in the absolute itself. But I would probably be inclined right now to see that there is a respect in which we've also transcended the contradictions insofar as we see all these steps as manifestations of one thing, the self-movement of thought and self-realization of thought. And so I would deal with the sense in which that seems insufficient. There must be a greater sense of reality, not just as phase, but a greater sense of remaining reality. I would deal this as similar to Karen's question about how something like Übergehen should persist as real in Hegel more than, strictly speaking, my story about the logic shows. So then what would happen is we would use the model of the logic to render intelligible, to the degree we can render intelligible nature, and we would discover that the way is clear to discover that there are real things that manifest those forms of contradictions, which, strictly speaking, in the logic, were reason we had to move on to try to transcend the contradictions, but not in a way that prevents us from recognizing that the contradictions are real in the sphere of nature and spirit. So that would be the way that I would incline to go there. You would like to know if it's similar to dialetheism, and I think the answer to that question, I'm a little bit, I've actually started on some other topic, dialogue with Priest, which now I see I'm going to have to continue. I'm a little bit fuzzy on exactly his motives and what's, strictly speaking, contained in dialetheism. But right now I'm inclined to think that if most of the content of that is some contradictions are true, then I think recognizing real contradictions will require Hegel to say yes to that. But I generally feel when I read Priest, for example, that his motives are pretty different than Hegel's, and that he's misunderstanding Hegel's motives when he interprets Hegel as a dialetheist as well. Just for example, sometimes it seems to me, not always, so I'm not sure about this, Priest would like to limit the contradictions to limit cases. So it's like when we try to think everything, and so this is his reading of Kant as well, we get antinomy contradictions, and those are the sense in which those contradictions. And in a way, he'd like to limit it there, because he seems kind of opposed to thinking that this or this would be a real contradiction. Then I think he's scared that contradiction breaks out everywhere, is my sense of it. And I think in a way it's the opposite for Hegel. It's at the limit case where we actually get of the absolute, that we get some kind of transcending contradictions. But here and here, they're everywhere. So it may be an inverse Graham-Priest form of dialetheism. I think I hit on everything.
The problem
I
with
can now.
this is that we can say that Hegel says that everything is contradictory, and not only some limited cases.
Although I think that consequently, when we say everything is contradictory, we gain access in Hegel to a perspective that's at the limit, that's the biggest thing which reconciles the contradictions. that makes it seem even more sort of anti-grammars. Thank you. This is super helpful.
Yeah, there is the next Paulo.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your lecture. And I have many questions. Let me try to make a synthesis in one only question, which is, will you dedicate some space in your project on the distinction between causality and explanation? It seems to me that in a sense of logic, they're really pretty fast at causality, but explanation is what remains and actually takes the place of causality explanations. And in this sense, we can also maybe temper an anthropologist's question about being, because being is something so, I believe that here Hegel welcomes Aristotle's teaching and say that being has many meanings. So, and we can get rid of many of the meanings of being, for example, copula, for example. But what interests Hegel maybe is what interests also Schelling and Fichte, is the existence, what exists. And the methodology, thinking the thought as a method, is what really exists. And so in this sense, these two questions seem to me to be related. I would have other questions about the Jacobi in the sense that
Please let me know sometime the Jacobi question. I would love to talk about that too. This is another kind of question I love coming here to get. So it's interesting about the distinction between causality and explanation. I think I know what you mean. And so I think personally, I would be happy to use the terms in that way. So the way I would be thinking is that causality carries this suggestion of one thing causing another thing, whereas explanation in the end would save room for something that's a more complete form of explanation and can be achieved in always thinking one thing just as causing another thing. And truth be told, I think I tried to use the term that way in my book and previous talking about these things. So Hegel, I think I said at various points, has a metaphysics, but it's a metaphysics of explanation. And I often get criticisms which are, no, Hegel's actually use of the term is quite negative. And really, he associates the term with the relations like causality that he examines in the Doctrine of Essence. So I'm experimenting and exploring with going over to the other side in that respect. But there's challenges for doing it that way, right? I mean, we're rendering things intelligible in terms of the absolute idea. And what is this intelligibility if not a form of Erklärung? And why would we have to segment the term in that way? So I'm pretty friendly to what you say. I'm not sure, in light of Hegel's own usage of the terminology, what the best thing is to say. I mean, I just keep getting the same challenge on that issue, which is whenever I explain it in terms of explanation, I always get people, including since the very first time I came to Padova, saying Erklärung belongs to the doctrine of essence. So I'm experimenting with letting them have the terminology. They think, I've gotten a question from people who know the overall language of Hegel and perform much better than I do. Maybe the term Erklärung does belong to the doctrine of essence. Then we just need something else like intelligible to mark the other thing. But personally, I like your way of thinking about it quite a bit. I'm not quite sure I saw the connection between that point, which I really like, and the relation back to, I mean, I do see my own sense of the relation back to Aristotle, which is that Aristotle is metaphysics of explanation. So okay, fair enough. But if I wanted to give something to my critics who think that Hegel uses Erklärung for the relation to the doctrine of essence, we just need something else, intelligibility or something like that, and we need to think of Aristotle as doing that, because of course it's all more difficult in Aristotle. There's different, I'm no scholar for languages and all, but of course there's always been problems, at least in English, and it probably reproduces itself in Italian in different ways, translating Aristotle in light of our contemporary ways of thinking about things like causality. So idea at certain points in English language, they were wanting to translate Aristotle's cause as explanation, and they thought this would make all the problems about how the four causes and Aristotle fit together, because at that point, English philosophy had a very deflationary sense of what an explanation is relative. But cause was the heavy metaphysical thing, explanation was more epistemological thing, which I think is the opposite way that you're thinking about it, or that I'm thinking about it, and the opposite of the way that I think it works in Aristotle. So I'm not really sure how to put the terminology together in the best way, but if I go for your terminological suggestion, then yeah, I think Aristotle's metaphysics is all about explanation, and there's something I'm sort of working on in the background here, which is, you've got an old question in Aristotle, what is metaphysics? Is it what is being qua being? That is the being question that I was pursuing here. Or is it a science of first things or highest things? Or is there some way to put those two things together? And to borrow your way of speaking, I would say that the answer, well, anyway, an answer that some suggest about Aristotle, the answer that I do think applies to Hegel is, in order to understand what it is to be in general, we have to explain that, using your terminological suggestion, in terms of what it is to be highest or absolute or first or something like that. And I'm not quite sure on the various resonances of existence in different forms of philosophy versus being yet. I'd like to learn more about what you're thinking there, that becomes the real question. I think I need to know, I would need to be better at languages and the history of metaphysics to catch all the resonances, but I'd love to learn more.
Thanks. I put myself on the list. Thanks for the talk. I do have a question, which I think is more clarificatory, about the way you use the notion of dependence, which plays a pivotal role in the whole story that you're telling, and in this sign that you introduced to capture that idea. Because during your talk, you use dependence associated with several other concepts in a kind of a broad way. So you talk about, yes, the fact that X causes epsilon is, of course, X, so epsilon depends on it.
Yeah.
You just X grounds, epsilon goes to the example from the logic dependence. So explanatory relation then can be also seen as relations of dependence. So X explains epsilon, that means, right?
As long as we don't want to use the terms as parallel suggestion, which I'm happy to.
Yeah. So, but that seems like part of the problem part of the question that Giovanna was asking seems to depend precisely on this broad meaning of dependence that you are using. So take other two examples. So X knows epsilon. Of course, in a way, epsilon depends on X. That's the problem of Kant, if I understand correctly your point, right? And so we have to understand what kind of dependence it is. So we have epistemological relations can be seen as relations of dependence, and so we have to stick. Okay, then take this new example. X thinks epsilon. Okay, is that a form of dependence or not? And in what sense? And then take this other example. So reason think of itself.
Yeah, of course.
We are using, as it seems that we are using the notion of dependence in these two cases differently. So that would be the question, or not. Because in the second case, reason think of itself, you want to say no, there is no dependence relation. There is no relation at all. It's not relational. There would be another issue.
Yeah.
But if you apply the notion of dependence to normal cases of thinking, that could be seen as relational. So I don't know how you see this issue, but I think if you distinguish the different meaning of dependence in these cases, including the one in which reason think of itself, you could maybe have a way to have Giovanna's point within your picture, and still keeping the overall architecture of your argument. I don't know whether...
This seems like a great question. I don't myself understand the connection back to Giovanna's question, although I'd be happy to hear more about that later, but let me just answer it on its own terms, because it's a great question. So first I want to seed that there is, of course, an epistemological parallel for all the thinking on the metaphysical side about dependence. And I liked your way of putting it in terms of X knows Y, or you could do it in terms of justification too, like one premise depends on a prior premise that justifies it, or that's the condition for it in that respect. So we can have parallel expressions of the issues on an epistemological side in the order of knowing or the order of justification, and also in the order of being or ontology or something like So I see that point. And now we're asking about, wait, if what I think of as thinking is relational in this sense, then I've got a problem because eventually I need reason to think itself, and that to overcome the trap, the poison in thinking in terms of relations. So I think, though, that this is just the epistemological side of the problem that I was talking about from Kant, although people who were in Berlin last week know that I think it's a problem that Jacobi raised as well, for the notion of a causa sui. So note that that's there in the causa sui too, right? Like what we take in that term is we take causality, which we would have otherwise thought of as this relation, and then we try to turn it back on itself. And then the very notion seems to threaten to be at odds with itself. And I'm not really sure that I see a way of speaking that doesn't have a similar problem, right? What does Hegel say in passage M? Sich selbst bestimmende. Well, I mean, that just takes the determining relation of bestimmen and turns it back on itself. Sich selbst will isn't the, I mean, we take the same thing. So in a way, there's one way of thinking where the really big problem for the German idealists is how to get this self-relation that's beyond relationality or something like that, without first positing causality and then saying, okay, take that and turn it back on itself, because that's always going to seem incoherent. So on my account, what I was trying to do was to show that how, or suggest how, a process of thinking could unfold without having tied itself to thinking that when you have a ground, you always have to think in terms of one thing grounding another, causing another, one thing thinking another thing, but without making any presuppositions about relations that might tie you to that, might ultimately come to a way of understand something as thinking itself, but not derivative of a normal thinking relation, where we have a separate thing thinking something separate, but we can ultimately, at the end, we're able to start with a self-relation and then build backwards to the normal forms of thinking. And so in a way, your question ends up seeming similar also to Karen's, like, can we preserve any real Übergang? And you're asking, like, if we got this thought as thinking itself, how could we be thinking about my computer or something like that? And the metaphysical, that was the epistemological side. The metaphysical side is how do we get back to ordinary causality? Because there's ordinary causality, right? Causes and noise to be made. But I guess what I'm thinking is we have to rethink those things as incomplete forms of what we have when we have thought thinking itself, to use the Aristotelian way of speaking. And that although our language doesn't allow us to phrase the thinking itself in a way that indicates how we're going to get beyond the tension that's in that very way of thinking, there's no substitute for going through the logic. We can't sum it up in an expression that doesn't have the same limitation. When we're done, we're supposed to be able to then think about incomplete forms of thought thinking itself as ordinary thinking. And I guess that would be the job of the philosophy of spirit, to reconstruct, just as I've been saying in response to Karen, for example, well, in the philosophy of nature, we're going to get the real version of Übergang. In response to you, in the philosophy of spirit, we're going to get the real forms of just me thinking about something, you know? But we're always going to have to trace that back to as an incomplete form of thought thinking. I don't know if that perfectly addressed your question, possibly because I just liked your question a lot. But we're going to have to turn it around one way or another somehow. We can't start with me thinking about my computer and build on that basis to thought thinking itself. The challenge, as I see it, is to get some process of thinking that will lead us to a place from which we can start with thought thinking itself, and then think about me thinking about my computer, rethink those things in that term. Mm-hmm. And same, as you pointed out, the epistemological side is just like the metaphysical side. So rethink causality in those terms as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And just quick follow up, and then you don't think that the relation between this, like, no, let's call it normal or usual way of understanding thinking and self-thinking, it shouldn't be a relation of dependence, otherwise.
The normal one.
I mean, it seems Hegel wants to establish a connection between the two, and the two forms of thinking, the two senses of thinking.
Oh, it shouldn't be one of dependence.
Often he seems to say, but in order to.
I think it is dependence, but just the other way around. So
But okay,
So I know it sounds like I'm saying we're getting beyond dependence altogether, but what I really want is that when we're done, we can reconstruct in terms of the absolute, the sorts of things we're talking about in essence, causality, and so on. And we can reconstruct being all in those terms. So we want to get something like causality back and something like dependence back, through which we can think how incomplete forms of the absolute depend on the absolute. That's what I mean to be kind of radical at the beginning when I say that for Hegel, like for Spinoza, there's an absolute and everything depends on the absolute. But to do that, we have to get more ordinary dependence, depends one thing on another. We need to get it back. So one way I think about this is, reaching back to Karen mentioned the divisions of the logic in terms of Übergehen, the relations of essence, and then we have development and Entwicklung as the sort of theme of the logical concept. The metaphor for Entwicklung at the beginning of the doctrine of the concept is an acorn growing into an oak tree, or a seed growing into the plant. And so there we have it's just an image, but I think it's meant to indicate that the whole life process is prior to any given stage, and we can explain any given stage in terms of the whole life process. But this isn't quite ordinary causality or dependence, because it's the elements of something depending on itself. So it's a kind of depending on yourself. But here we're separating the elements from the whole thing. And so we start to see how we could get a notion of priority. The whole life form is prior to any of its stages. And order and a sense of dependence, the stages depend on the life form. And that's the way that we're going to try to get dependence back. So ordinary thinking might be one element in the overall process of thought, but it's the overall process that makes the element what it is. And that's this kind of dependence that expresses the way in which the ordinary thinking does in fact depend on the absolute form.
Okay, so there are good forms of dependence in a way.
Well, I mean, it goes back to Karen's question of if I want to throw away being and if I want to throw away a relation, and I think Karen put it better, better, more accurate to my view, insofar as having already asked a similar question last Friday. There's a way in which we must rethink dependence and transform how we understand what it is. So there's a good transformation of dependence.
Cool, thanks. I've got one more question, Michel. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your talk. It was more than challenging. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. So if I took your argument well, I mean, you're kind of challenging the historical approach that has been taken of the relation between Kant and Hegel, right? In terms of what is thought about the purpose of the critique of pure reason. I mean, in terms of reading it as an epistemological, investigation of our conditions for knowledge, or as opening or as limiting our let's say our aspiration to do metaphysics, right? And in this second term, right, it leads in some way or another, it leaves a space open for Hegel to challenge the Kant's critique of metaphysics by going back to a Spinozistic approach to metaphysics, but at the same time, avoiding or taking into account the Kant's critique to avoid the dogmatic approaches to metaphysics that Spinoza does, right? So if I take this seriously, right, or rightfully, do you think that Hegel succeeds in giving metaphysics or in making metaphysics an option for philosophy again? And this goes back to this, because this question took me back to Elena's talk in Berlin about timeliness and untimeliness, right? Because again, it is I take your talk to be again another historical approach which takes, let's see how Hegel sees the arguments, and then see what is the result of them. So please, so again, if you think that Hegel succeeds in making metaphysics again an option for philosophy, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's an interesting to go back to rethinking things in terms of that question. So in my view, whatever I say about it, metaphysics is an option for philosophy again, and has been an option for philosophy again for some time. In a way, I think it never was not an option, although people mistakenly thought it was not an option. So I'm sympathetic with the spirit of what I was calling passage C from Kant, which is that all along, when people thought they were not thinking metaphysically, they were still thinking metaphysically. They were just doing so very naively and uncritically. So contemporary philosophy doesn't need Hegel in order to make metaphysics an option again. I do think that contemporary philosophy has returned to forms of metaphysics that are kind of uncritical. So, and I don't think that contemporary philosophy has done a good job with engaging with the real meat of Kant's critique of metaphysics. They're not, I think contemporary metaphysics tends to assume that they have fine ways of dismissing, and I think this is correct, the old sort of positivist worries that metaphysics is meaningless. That's just not a very good attack on metaphysics, and the contemporary metaphysicians are correct that they can throw that under the bus, not even worry about it. They tend to assume that Kant's criticism is similar in form to that, and so they're not particularly worried about Kant. And consequently, no one is worried enough about the antinomy and the things that Kant says in the Dialectic. So one thing we can do by the method I recommend is expose the contemporary metaphysics that's come back to the serious challenge in Kant. And so I would put the question, the challenge for Hegel more is, can Hegel show us the way towards a way of doing metaphysics that would be more sophisticated today with respect to the actual Kantian challenges? And woo, it's a big ask. I'm not sure how to take the question. If the question is, do I think I'm going to convince a lot of contemporary metaphysicians to turn Hegelian? Probably not that many of them am I going to convince of that. But those of us who want to go down the path, yes, I think there's a path there to do things that addresses the kinds of things we're talking about in contemporary metaphysics, but in a way that's more informed by Kantian worries about metaphysics. For that matter, I think there's a path open for those who would like to advance what I think the true cause of Kant is, namely advancing this antinomy argument in favor of epistemic restrictions that would move contemporary philosophy in another interesting direction that it hasn't particularly explored yet. So for me, all of this is very helpful in opening up paths. I'm not sure how popular they will be. I used to be a predictor of where philosophy was going insofar as I predicted that metaphysics would become more important, and I feel like that's been true. But what's coming next, I feel less capable of predicting.
Okay. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay, so then we close our lecture. We thank very much Jim